All right, everyone get ready, because today we are going way back in time
Way back.
to ancient India.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, around 600 to 300 BCE,
Yeah.
to explore the Mahajanapadas.
Oh, what are those?
They were these powerful states that emerged in the Ganges Valley. It was a period of massive change, really like a turning point in Indian history.
Oh.
Imagine a whole civilization kind of taking shape and evolving right before our eyes.
I can already see that this is going to be a really cool deep dive.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
So about these Mahajanapadas, they weren't just like strong-arm states, right?
No, they weren't.
They were really innovative.
Yeah, for sure.
And they were kind of experimenting with all these different new ways of governing themselves.
Oh, totally. And they laid the groundwork for the empires that followed and the more complex societies that we see coming out of India.
So they were kind of setting the stage.
Yeah, they were really pioneers.
That's cool.
So we've got a pretty hefty stack of sources for this one.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, we've got historical records, archaeological findings, even philosophical texts.
So we're going to get a really well-rounded picture of how these states functioned.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to really try to understand how these Mahajanapadas actually, ran themselves.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah, what were their secrets to success? Were they inventing, early forms of bureaucracy, legal codes, administrative systems?
I wonder, how much of what we think of as modern governance could have originated in these ancient states?
That's what we're here to find out. Now, to kind of set the scene, we have to picture the dramatic transition happening in India during this time. We're talking about a major shift from nomadic life to settled agriculture.
Yeah, that's a huge shift.
It wasn't just about, learning new farming techniques. It was a whole new way of life.
Impacts everything.
Yeah, social structures, beliefs,
Yeah.
how people related to the world around them.
So how did that shift specifically impact governance?
Well, when you're not constantly on the move, you've got to find new ways to organize yourself.
You need systems
Exactly.
to manage all of that.
Right, you need leadership, administration.
Yeah, and you need to find ways for people to, live together in close proximity and cooperate.
Yeah, and to solve disputes and all of that.
Absolutely.
So were they basically just figuring it out as they went along?
It wasn't totally from scratch. I
Right.
mean, they definitely drew inspiration from existing social structures and beliefs.
That makes sense.
And they had to adapt those to this rapidly changing world. And this is where the Vedas come in.
Ah, the Vedas, our old friends.
Yes, exactly.
We did a deep dive on the Vedas a while back, but for those who haven't heard it, maybe give us a little recap.
Sure. So think of the Vedas as this incredible collection of hymns and prayers and rituals and philosophical insights. They were composed over centuries, and they weren't written down at first. They were passed down orally, which is amazing.
It's like this library of ancient wisdom.
Right. And so there are 4 main Vedas, and they each offer a unique perspective on how the ancient Indians saw the world.
I love that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So are the Vedas like a rule book for the Mahajanapadas? Do they lay out specific instructions on governing?
No, it's not that straightforward.
Okay.
The Vedas, while insightful, are full of symbolism and metaphor, and the language is very poetic, so it requires, a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, I get it. It's like we're trying to decipher a code
Exactly. It's a puzzle.
rather than reading a straightforward manual.
Right, exactly.
So how do we connect these ancient poetic texts to the practical realities of running a state?
Well, they don't directly tell us how to create a tax system or run a court,
Right.
but they do give us clues about the underlying principles and values.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of principles are we talking about?
Well, consider the concept of Dharma. You've probably heard of this. It's a central theme in the Vedas. It's about duty, righteousness, and living in alignment with the cosmic order.
Right.
So how do you think that concept would influence governance?
Okay, so it's pretty abstract and philosophical.
It is.
But I guess, if everyone has specific duties based on their role in society, then that would apply to leaders too, right?
Exactly. Dharma was like the bedrock of social order.
Oh, I see.
And the sense of duty would have extended to rulers and officials, shaping how they saw their responsibilities.
So like an ethical framework for leadership.
I like that.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's really interesting.
And this whole idea of duty was further reinforced by another key concept from the Vedas, karma.
Oh, karma.
Yeah, the idea that actions have consequences, both good and bad. So if you're a ruler and you know that your actions have karmic repercussions, you're probably going to think twice before you make a bad decision.
It's like an early form of checks and balances.
Right, exactly. It's a system of accountability, even for those in power.
So we're seeing these philosophical ideas potentially shaping the way these states were governed.
I think so. And to understand it further, we need to look at the actual structures of the Mahajanapadas. Now, they didn't all have the same type of political system.
Wait, different types.
Yes. Some were monarchies, with a king at the helm, while others were republics, where power was shared among a group of elites.
Whoa, so not all Mahajanapadas were governed the same way.
Exactly.
This is getting good.
I know, right? We've got monarchies, we got republics.
Tell me more.
All right, let's start with the monarchies. One of the most powerful Mahajanapadas was the kingdom of Magadha, and they had a really well-structured monarchy.
What made it so special?
Well, they had a sophisticated system of taxation, with officials responsible for collecting revenue from different regions.
Oh, so they were organized.
Very organized. And they also had a standing army, which was pretty rare at the time. This allowed them to expand their territory and defend their borders.
So efficient tax collection and a strong military, that sounds like a recipe for success.
It certainly was for Magadha.
All right, so what about those republics? You mentioned republics, and
Yeah.
they didn't have a king, so how did they function?
Yeah. The republics, like the Vajjian Confederacy, were really interesting. Power was vested in a council of elders who were elected from among the leading families or clans.
So it was like a democracy, but only for the elite.
Yeah, you could say that. The commoners didn't have direct political representation.
Interesting. So even in these early republics, we see these different levels of power and influence.
It's a pattern we see throughout history.
I'm curious, did these different systems, the monarchies and the republics, did they interact with each other? Were they like constantly at war, or did they ever cooperate?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another key aspect of the Mahajanapadas: diplomacy and alliances. These states weren't isolated. They were constantly interacting, forming alliances, engaging in trade, and yes, sometimes going to war.
So it sounds like a pretty complex web of relationships.
It definitely was.
Any standout examples of these interactions?
Yeah. Well, one that comes to mind is the marriage alliance between Bimbisara, the king of Magadha, and the daughter of the king of the Lichhabis, a powerful clan within the Vajjian Confederacy. This alliance really strengthened Magadha's position.
Strategic marriage is a classic power move.
It never goes out of style.
It sounds like these Mahajanapadas were already playing the game of politics as we know it today.
You could say that.
This is amazing. We've covered so much ground already.
I know, it's fascinating.
We've talked about the philosophical underpinnings of governance in the Vedas, the practical realities of monarchies and republics, and we've even touched on strategic alliances and diplomacy.
But we're just scratching the surface.
I have a feeling there's much more to uncover.
There is, and that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
I'm already hooked. Can't wait to see what other secrets these Mahajanapadas have in store for us.
Me neither.
Okay, welcome back to our deep dive into the Mahajanapadas. Last time we were talking about the fascinating mix of political systems these ancient states developed, from monarchies with powerful kings to republics with councils of elders.
Right.
I'm still thinking about how they were forming alliances and strategic marriages.
It's pretty incredible, right?
It's like something straight out of like a modern-day political drama.
Yeah, like a historical soap opera or something.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But, beyond those big picture political structures, the monarchies and republics, did they have anything resembling what we might call a bureaucracy today?
Good question.
And with specialized officials,
Yeah.
clearly defined roles. I mean, were they just winging it, or did they have systems in place?
Well, it's definitely more than just winging it.
Okay.
It wasn't quite the complex bureaucracies that we see in modern states, but they are getting there.
Right.
They had systems.
Yeah.
Remember, these societies were growing larger and more complex, so
Right.
they needed organization.
Yeah. Well, I'm ready to hear all about the ancient Indian bureaucracies, so give me the inside scoop. What kind of officials did they have? What were their responsibilities?
Okay, well, one key role that appears in this period is what's called an amatya.
Amatya.
Yeah, and you can translate this as like minister or high official.
Okay, so kind of like a cabinet of advisors.
Yeah, good analogy.
Cool.
And each of these amatyas would have a specific area that they were responsible for.
Right.
Now, in a monarchy, they were appointed by the ruler, but in republics, they were actually elected.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, you might have some amatyas who were focused on finance and revenue collection.
Right.
Others might oversee the military, justice, public works, kind of a division of labor.
Wow, that's pretty organized.
It is. It is. Now, you might be wondering, did these amatyas have any formal training?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Like, were they just chosen because of their family connections?
Well, family connections probably played a role, but there is evidence that some Mahajanapadas actually had formal systems for training and selecting officials.
Oh, wow. Pretty cool, huh?
That is cool. Like, what kind of evidence are we talking about? So, for example, in the Arthashastra, you've probably heard of it.
Yeah, the Arthashastra. It's like a handbook for rulers,
West,
right? It's
yes.
full of
Yeah.
all sorts of advice on, like, diplomacy and espionage. It's like a Machiavellian guide to power in ancient India.
It kind of is, yeah. And it's very relevant to our conversation today because it was written around the same time as the Mahajanapadas were flourishing.
So it's like a window into their thinking.
Yeah. I mean, we have to be careful about taking everything literally, right? Different states probably had their own practices,
Right.
but it's a valuable source for understanding how they viewed governance.
Absolutely. Does it give specific examples of administrative practices in the Mahajanapadas? Like, how did they actually collect taxes? How did they maintain law and order?
Well, it emphasizes a well-organized system for collecting land revenue,
Oh, okay.
which makes sense. Land was super important.
Right.
So officials would measure the land and classify it based on how fertile it was.
Okay, so no more just like guesstimating.
No, they were becoming much more systematic.
That's really interesting.
It's about efficiency.
Right.
And it's about fairness, too. The Arthashastra talks about punishments for officials who were corrupt or took bribes.
Oh, wow. So they had systems for accountability.
Yeah, they did.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we see these values that we talked about earlier, like Dharma and karma, actually being woven into these practices.
Right. So it's not just like abstract philosophy.
No, it has real-world consequences.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so they had ministers, they had tax collectors, systems for training officials. What about law and order? Did they have anything resembling a legal code? Courts, judges?
Yes, they did have ways of resolving disputes and enforcing laws,
Okay.
but those systems were usually decentralized.
Decentralized. Like, was there a Supreme Court of ancient India or something?
Not quite. It was more local.
At
So
all.
you'd have assemblies or councils often made up of elders who would hear cases and issue judgments.
So, like, community-based justice.
Yeah, you could say that. Of course, that's not to say that it was always fair or impartial.
Right. There's always the potential for bias in any system.
Exactly. But it was how they did things back then. Now, in some Mahajanapadas, you would have a higher authority.
Yeah. Okay.
Like in Magadha, there's evidence of royal courts where the king would hear appeals and pronounce final judgments.
Oh, so he was like the final word.
Right. It kind of is like a Supreme Court, but with a very powerful single judge.
I like that analogy. It makes sense that the ruler would play a key role in maintaining law and order.
Yeah, and remember, the king was also seen as the upholder of Dharma.
Right. It all ties back to that.
It does, it does.
This is really incredible. It's making me rethink my whole understanding of how ancient societies functioned.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is. It really is. It seems like the Mahajanapadas were experimenting with all these different models of governance.
Yeah.
And they were developing like increasingly sophisticated systems for administration.
They were definitely figuring things out.
Yeah, and they were grappling with the same challenges of justice and fairness that we still face today.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that history is full of these surprising twists and turns, right? We tend to think of history as this straight line from simple to complex, but it's much messier than that.
Yeah, it's not a straight line.
It's more of a winding path full of experimentation.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating. I have a feeling that there's still more to discover about the Mahajanapadas, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Now that we have a good grasp of their internal structures,
Right.
let's zoom out a bit.
Yeah.
Let's think about how they interacted with the wider world, because the Mahajanapadas weren't isolated, right?
Right.
They were part of this vast network of trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange.
So there's a whole other layer to explore.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, I can't wait to see what other fascinating connections we're going to uncover.
Me neither.
All right, welcome back to our exploration of the Mahajanapadas. We've learned so much about their internal workings, like their governments and systems.
Right, their innovation.
It's really remarkable how advanced and complex these ancient states actually were.
And as we kind of shift our focus now to look at their interactions with the wider world,
Right.
we're going to see how they were not just shaping their own destinies, but they really influenced the course of history in the Indian subcontinent and even beyond.
Okay, I am ready to expand our horizons.
All right, let's do it.
So paint me a picture. What was the world like around the Mahajanapadas?
Well, imagine this vibrant tapestry of cultures and languages and beliefs stretching across the Indian subcontinent and beyond.
Okay, I can picture it.
Now remember, the Mahajanapadas weren't operating in isolation.
Right.
They were part of a really dynamic network of interactions, both peaceful and sometimes not so peaceful.
So it wasn't all just alliances and strategic marriages?
No, definitely not.
There were rivalries and conflicts, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were constantly vying for power and resources,
Right.
engaging in territorial disputes, forming alliances, breaking alliances.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this competition, while it could be destructive, it also spurred a lot of innovation and growth.
It's like a real-life Game of Thrones.
I could say that.
Were there any particular rivalries that really stand out?
One major one was the struggle between Magadha and Kosala.
Okay, I've heard of Magadha.
Yeah, they were two of the most powerful Mahajanapadas.
Right.
And they clash repeatedly over territory and influence, each one wanting to establish dominance over those fertile Gangetic plains.
What was so special about those plains?
Well, they were incredibly fertile, which made them ideal for agriculture.
Right. Makes sense.
But they were also strategically located with access to important trade routes.
So whoever controlled the plains basically controlled wealth and power.
You got it. It's like a strategic resource hotspot.
Totally. So how did this rivalry between Magadha and Kosala play out? Who came out on top?
Well, Magadha was really clever.
Okay.
They used a combination of diplomacy, they had a strong military, and they formed some really strategic alliances. And they eventually emerged as the dominant power in the region.
So they were kind of setting the stage for the Mauryan Empire.
Exactly.
That's incredible to think about.
It's like the seeds of empire were already being sown during this time.
Wow. But it wasn't all about war and conquest, right?
Mm.
You mentioned trade and cultural exchange. Tell me more about that side of things.
Yeah, so alongside the conflicts and the power struggles,
Right.
there was also this vibrant flow of goods and ideas and people across the region.
Okay.
So the Mahajanapadas were connected by this amazing network of trade routes, both overland and maritime.
I'm picturing ancient caravans and ships laden with all sorts of treasures.
Oh yeah, totally. And they were trading with each other, and they were also linked to these distant lands.
What were they trading?
Well, they were famous for their textiles, especially fine muslin and silk, which everyone wanted.
Ooh, fancy.
Right? They also exported precious stones, ivory, timber, spices.
This place is nice.
Yeah, so these goods were in high demand, not just in the neighboring regions, but as far away as the Roman Empire.
No way, the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
So these ancient Indian states were part of a global network.
Oh, yeah, they were connected.
Incredible.
And, this trade wasn't just about economic exchange. It also helped spread ideas and technologies and cultural practices.
Oh, bet.
Yeah, like you can even see the influence of Persian art and architecture in some of the structures that they built during this period.
So it was happening organically just through these everyday interactions.
Yeah, I mean, traders and travelers and pilgrims, they're all mingling and sharing.
Right.
But the Mahajanapadas also recognized that there was strategic value in cultural diplomacy.
Oh, interesting. Like how?
Well, they would use gifts, they would patronize the arts, they would exchange scholars and religious figures.
So smart.
Yeah, to kind of build relationships and, enhance their prestige.
It's amazing to see those same tactics at play in the ancient world.
Right, like history repeats itself.
It really does. Okay, we've covered so much ground. Rivalries, alliances, trade, cultural exchange. What a dynamic and complex period.
It was.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Mahajanapadas, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to take away?
Well, first, I hope they remember that the Mahajanapadas weren't just like a stepping stone to empire.
Right.
They were these really vibrant, innovative societies in their own right. They were
Yeah.
experimenting with all these different ways of governing themselves, developing these sophisticated systems, and really engaging with the world around them in these really interesting ways.
It's like a reminder that we should never underestimate the people of the past. They
Yeah.
were doing incredible things.
Absolutely. And second, I hope they take away an appreciation for how interconnected the ancient world actually was.
Right.
The Mahajanapadas were not isolated.
Yeah.
They were part of this vast network of trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange that stretched across continents.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that we're all connected in ways that we may not always realize.
Exactly. And finally, I hope that this deep dive has inspired our listeners to just learn more about this fascinating period in Indian history.
Oh yeah, there's so much more to explore.
So much.
So to everyone listening out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into history. Thank you all so much for joining us on this incredible journey.
It's been a pleasure.